Good afternoon, IST2020, and welcome to our afternoon session at the IST stage, the IST2020 stage. And I would like to welcome you all to this afternoon session. And I would in particular like to welcome our keynote speaker, Koen Frenken, whom many of you know. Koen Frenken is a full professor in innovation studies at the University of Utrecht, Copernicus Institute, and he did his PhD in both Grenoble and Amsterdam. And as you know, or many of you will know, he has been working on a wide variety of areas of and so I hope it works now. So, and as many of you know, Koen has been working on a wide variety of fields, including evolutionary economics, institutional sociology, complexity theory, including modeling work. And with his background in economic geography, he has also been one of the first to really dive into this newly emerging area of research in the platform economy. And I think this has been at the very early stage an area which raised a lot of interest and created also a lot of enthusiasm about the potential of the platform economy to contribute to sustainability transitions. But in the meantime, we have learned that a variety of also critical and negative consequences of platform economy and sharing need to be taken into account. And Koen was certainly one of the first who was looking into matters of how to safeguard the public interests in the context of the emergence of the platform economy, and in particular also at institutional solutions of how to improve the operation and the role of platform solutions in our societies. So with these few words as a start, I would just like to add some practical considerations on the further on this session. So after Koen's plenary presentation, we will again use the format that we used yesterday. So that means that you can write your questions and comments in the chat, and I will pick them up and pose some of the questions that will be raised to Koen in the question and answer part of this session. So, and with these few introductory words, I would like to hand over to Koen Frenken for his plenary talk on the subject of the rise of the platform economy. Koen, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thanks for attending this session. I will now share my screen. So my talk is about the platform economy, which, if you like, constitutes a very important transition in our economy next to sustainability transitions. And I've been looking at this phenomenon for the past 5 or 6 years or so. And gradually, I discovered that for me, at least, an institutional perspective, in particular, an institutional sociological perspective, provides me the best framework to understand this emerging and complex phenomenon. And if you want to talk about the rise of the platform economy, one way to look at this is to see what are by now the most important firms in our global economy. And if you look at the 10 most valuable firms in our economy, 7 out of 10 are actually platform businesses. So the top 5 or the top 6 consist of 5 US platform firms: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. And below that, we also have the 2 giants in China and beyond providing platform services. And all these 7 companies have been founded not so long ago, which shows that they have been able to increase their value at an unprecedented rapid rate. If you further look at the geography of platforms, again, we see China and US dominating the scene, and some fewer other countries like India and Indonesia also having some successful platforms in their own domestic markets. But if you then look at Europe, they are almost absent in the platform economy, which also worries the European Commission a lot, because it means that European countries, as well as governments, increasingly have become dependent on US or Chinese technology to run their services and economy. And that is why the most recent European Commission statements point to increasing regulation of these platforms in Europe. But also they voiced attempts to create and stimulate the creation of European platforms in the near future. But from an academic point of view, probably the first question to ask is, okay, what do we actually mean if we talk about an online platform? Here I follow Martin Kenny and John Seisman, who talk about platforms as mediating social and economic interactions online. So it means that platforms are not limited to digital marketplaces like eBay or Uber, but include also the platforms we use to interact socially, which can be gaming, can be dating, can be social media, and what have you. And a second thing, when talking about platform, which in my view is very important, is to understand the hierarchical nature of the platform economy. So even though the notion of a platform suggests a kind of flat space where all participants are equal, the way platforms are organized is inherently hierarchical in 2 ways. First of all, to run a platform on your mobile phone or computer, you need a particular operating system like Android or Apple, which can put constraints on the type of platforms you can download and how you can use it. The second aspect of the hierarchical nature of platform economy is that platforms also put constraints on us, on users. By downloading an app, you have to accept unilaterally the terms and conditions, which means that you grant platforms the right to extract data, thus value, from your actions, but also they retain the right to ban you from the platform at any time and without previous notice, because they have a technological means to cut you off from the platform. Now, to understand how these platform companies could grow so fast in the last 1 or 2 decades, it's important to remind ourselves that platforms are basically intermediating between people who otherwise organize themselves their activities. That is, platforms match people who want to interact, but the way they interact and the means they use to do so are owned by the user. So here there's a nice picture by Tom Goodwin saying, well, Uber, you could say it's the largest taxi company in the world, but it doesn't own vehicles. Facebook is the biggest media company without creating its own content. Alibaba and Amazon is the biggest retailer, but does not have to hold any inventory because it only connects smaller retailers to clients. And Airbnb, you could say, is the largest hotel without owning any real estate. So what is common to platforms is that they only provide the software to interact and not having to invest in the means of production or the content that is being exchanged on the platforms. And that's why they can scale so fast, because when millions of people start to download an app, and a platform can grow very big overnight. It is further important to understand there are a lot of different type of platforms, and Charles Baldwin's latest book is very clear on this. So we have the first differentiation between platforms, between technology and exchange platforms. So technology platforms are these operating platforms I talked about before. And exchange platforms are all the apps we use to interact. And those exchange platforms in turn can be divided into information sharing platforms, mainly social media, and transaction platforms, that is digital marketplaces. And among transaction platforms, you can again distinguish between business to consumer platforms like Amazon and Booking, where you as a client buy from a small business or rent a hotel room. And consumer to consumer or peer-to-peer platforms, where individual people start to engage in economic transactions, like renting out the home or car in the sharing economy, or providing personal services in the gig economy, varying from cleaning, taxi services, tutoring, what have you. And my talk, the remainder of my talk, will only be about the sharing in the gig economy, because they are not only the most recent type of platform, having been founded only 10 years ago, but they are also the platforms that have most effects on the ground, because these platforms are used by people to organize their daily lives in terms of mobility or housing, or other kind of consumer acts, which have severe effects on the local economy. They can have externalities in neighborhoods and pose a lot of regulatory questions to local authorities. Now, my first paper, if you like, about the sharing economy with presented this scheme. And this scheme was developed to try to make sure that if we talk about sharing economy, we are very precise and that we distinguish it from other kinds of platforms. So sharing economy for me is about consumers, C2C, that provide each other temporary access to their underutilized goods. So every time you do not use a particular consumer item like a car or a house, you could rent it out or lend it out to another consumer. And to find the matches between consumers, we increasingly use platforms for that. The gig economy, by contrast, is about individuals offering personal services, so they give each other access to their labor, which is entirely different also from a regulatory point of view than the sharing economy. So Uber and Deliveroo are a part of the gig economy. Then we also have platforms in the second-hand market, eBay, and then we talk about consumers who grant each other permanent access instead of temporary access because they sell their goods. And then we have the product service economy, which consists of businesses who rent out their assets to consumers on a temporary basis. And then we talk about a business to consumer business model instead of a consumer to consumer business model. Now we can ask now about all these type of platforms, what is really new with the development of these platforms? Well, let's first talk about what is not new about these platforms. Well, in my view, platforms basically mediate social practices that already existed, albeit in an informal manner. So before the advent of platforms, for example, in the sharing economy, people were already sharing their cars. They were already engaging in hitchhiking or rented out their home when they were not present. And they were already delivering personal services, often in an informal labor market, including tutoring, food delivery, and domestic cleaning. And even taxi in some cities was very much an informal business. So what this means is that the platforms on their own have not really changed the practices and the acts of consumption and production per se. What they mostly changed is the way they are organized in an online environment. So what makes platforms so unique is that they have a technological capability as an online intermediary to keep track of everyone on the platform in terms of how they behave, what transactions they engage in, what kind of reviews they leave, where they are located, and so forth. And this surveillance capability of platforms allow them to collect vast amount of data that they can resell to third parties or can combine into new services themselves. They are also able, using the information on participants, to engage in algorithmic matching, which saves a lot on labor because they can make the matches. And they can, as I explained, exclude participants at will. And it is especially the last feature that makes platform a private regulator. Because platforms, for example, if people have a lot of bad reviews, retain the right to ban these participants from the platform in order to have the platform participants behave and interact in ways that the platform wants them to do so. And the decision to ban someone from the platform, or maybe to rank them very low in algorithmic searches, those decisions are based on an ex-post performance evaluation. So in principle, everyone can enter a platform, but if you ex-post turn out not to perform as a platform wishes you to do so, this may be a reason for them to ban you. And this is very much a new institution compared with the past. Because in most markets in the past, performance was regulated ex ante by making sure that people who are active in a certain business have a diploma and have a license to operate. Instead, platforms bypass these old regulations and allow, in principle, everyone on the platform and only regulate ex post. Okay, so this is a bit the ABC about platforms, and now we can turn to the social science literature on platforms. And we see, of course, a lot of research in many different disciplines. So the psychologists typically look at motives. Why do people start using platforms? In the management literature, they see platforms very much as a disruptive innovation. Economists look at pricing on platforms and by platforms using algorithms. And microsociologists, for example, those in Utrecht, are very much interested in trust. So what determines that two parties trust each other online? Finally, economic sociologists are mostly interested in the labor issue and the problem of precarity. If we now turn to our own field, I think the most interesting avenues for research are two. First of all, we can ask the question, how come after the 10 years of platforms have not been able to gain legitimacy in society? So that is a typical institutional question to ask. The second question that may also interest many of you is, what about the sustainability impacts of these platforms? And how can we leverage platforms in the future to foster, for example, sustainability transitions? Now, the remainder of my talk will be about these topics. Now, about legitimacy, I think this is a very timely question, because reading the newspapers, we see almost on a weekly basis accounts in many different countries about protests, about conflicts, about court cases concerning all kinds of platforms. So it is fair to say that platforms are not seen as legitimate by many type of actors. And quite interestingly, there are many type of actors involved here. For example, in the upper left, we see residents of a neighborhood who protest against Airbnb because of the externalities and rising house prices they generate. On the upper right, by contrast, we see homeowners who rent out their home via Airbnb, who want to have Airbnb legalized as much as possible. On the lower left, we see a Deliveroo rider who asks for a living wage. And on the right-hand side below, we see a traditional taxi driver who protests against Uber, claiming they engage in unfair competition practices. So definitely there's a lot of contestation going on. And if you try to summarize what is going on, there are different tensions at the same time. And for me, the three main ones with the sharing and the gig economy are the following. First of all, there is a classification issue in that platforms legally try to classify themselves as an e-commerce business. And according to e-commerce law in most countries, this means that you are considered just an intermediary and that you are not responsible for the actions that users undertake using your platform. It is also a way to avoid sectoral regulations that may apply. If you are an e-commerce business, you don't need to comply to taxi regulations, as do regular taxi operators, for example. Now, a second strategy that platforms follow is that they do not share data with government. And they are also not, they cannot be forced to in most cases, because the users of the platforms are protected by privacy law. So platforms actually cannot just share data with government. However, government is desperate to try to get more information about users of platforms, because they know many people who sell their services or rent out their homes do not comply to health and safety concerns and regulations, and often do not pay their taxes. So this also creates a problem for government in terms of a rising number of people earning money through these platforms. And the final problem with platforms is that they treat and classify their suppliers as freelancers and not as their employees. So they argue that everyone can log in, log out when they want, and they are free to accept any client they like. They are basically freelancers. But at the same time, platforms exercise control and surveillance over these people, and they can be punished if they underperform or do not show up at an assignment. And in that sense, many labor lawyers think platforms are actually employers and the workers should be seen as employees. And this is a very thorny issue, because it is about the very distinction in labor law between an employee and a freelancer, which goes back more than 100 years. Now, if we want to understand where these institutional conflicts come from the perspective of our own discipline, I think there are three possible avenues to travel. I tried to apply these three perspectives in different studies. And I'll tell you a bit what came out of our research so far. So first of all, we have the multi-level perspective, which does not need much introduction. And in previous work, we found out it does not really fit very well with what's happening with the advent of platforms. And the reason why the NLP does not seem to fit so well this phenomenon is that the platform in itself does not challenge the specific social technical regimes and also does not challenge the practices and technologies on which it is based. So take, for example, car sharing or ride-hailing like Uber. They, of course, introduce a new business model, but they still reinforce, if you like, the social technical regime of the car. And what is quite interesting is that some of the more radical niches that emerged in the beginning, for example, cooperatives who owned cars and rented them out in a neighborhood, became co-opted by other kind of business models that also called themselves car sharing, but actually used private car owners as suppliers of cars. And that only reinforced the regime of private car ownership. So I think the MLP only becomes relevant if some of these C2C platforms evolve into B2C platforms. That is, if these platforms start to source in the capital assets that you need to provide a service, like cars or homes, and then they become interested in what kind of technology to use. And then sustainability regulations may force them to start using the most sustainable option available. And a framework that, to me, fits a bit better is that of what I called reverse technology assessment. So what I observed in all the discussions about platforms, especially in the Netherlands, is that there is an inability of regulators and the larger public to properly assess the technology and the desirability and downsides of that new technology. So you know that most artifacts like drugs or cars or food or airplanes, they are all subject to institutionalized forms of regulation, in which first a lot of scientific evidence has to be collected about the working and the risks of a particular artifact. Then there is a debate among experts and often also the public about the desirability of that new technology. Then politicians have to make a decision whether and under what conditions to grant access to the market, and then the innovation enters the market. So that's what we call technology assessment. But with platforms, the whole process seems to go the other way around, because a platform is introduced as an app, and an app can be downloaded by everyone, and even across national borders. So what platform companies do is they just launch an app, and they have their users start using that app without asking permission, without doing any assessment. Once the app is used on a massive scale and starts to create problems in society, like what we've seen with Uber and Airbnb, politicians have to act. But they have to act without a proper public debate and without scientific evidence on the effects of the new technology. Because to collect the proper scientific evidence, a government would need to have access to the data of the platform, which they do not release to scientists for technology assessment. So this creates a problem in our normal way of assessing new technologies. Now, the final perspective that I want to share with you today, that I elaborated with a couple of colleagues, is that of institutional logics. And institutional logics are not the institutions present in specific social technical systems, but they are the broader societal institutions that we use to organize our economy and our daily lives. So here's a definition that says that it's about practices, values, and beliefs by which individuals produce their material subsistence and also organize their daily lives. And historically, these authors say there have been 7 ways, 7 logics to organize social life, which started with the family and the community, and later religion and the state became more important. And at some point, market institutions and professional organizations were introduced. And the most recent institutional logic is that of the modern corporation, which is an institutional invention of roughly 150 years old. And this scheme allows you to look at the platforms in a kind of encompassing way, because you can ask the question, how do platforms fit in the current institutional logics? And there you have to distinguish between 2 layers of the platform. There is the platform company itself, and there are all those million people, individuals who make use of the platform. Now, if we start looking from the platform company itself, it fits perfectly in the corporation and the market logic. Why? It is a corporation that can grow quickly in size and gain market power. And in fact, often we see a winner-takes-all dynamic. And in the market, they compete with other platforms on prices, and they're backed by shareholders and venture capitalists that are into the game for a decent profit. However, the people who make use of a platform, they are not fitting very well with the corporation and market logic. Because if you are an individual and you make a living via a platform, you cannot grow your business in size. You cannot really act as an entrepreneur, because in most platforms, transactions are limited to a single person with a single account. On the other hand, if you make a living on a platform, you're not really operating in a free market. Prices can be manipulated by the platform or set by the platform. The matching algorithms already pre-structured choice of business partner. And it's very hard to make a profit, because the platform takes away most of the surplus via commissions. So what we concluded in this paper is that these so-called freelancers are not fitting market and corporation logics, but they are neither protected by other logics. We haven't seen many successful platforms by professional organizations. We haven't seen any platforms by governments, even though in principle, any local government, for example, could start an Airbnb type of platform, but we don't see that happening. The only thing we see happening a little bit is that communities form and create their own platforms. And such communities are typically those freelancers who start and build their own platform and then try to sell their services via their own platform, so they reap all the benefits and don't have to pay a commission to a commercial party. So this is for now how I try to make sense of platforms in different sectors. And again, because these platforms challenge very basic institutions in our society, such as labor law, health and safety regulations, but also competition law, privacy law, discrimination. All those issues are not specific to certain social technical regimes, but rather are part of the broader institutional logics. And that's why I think this perspective is helpful. Now, to finish off, I want to share some considerations about the sustainability impacts of online platforms. I won't go into the fact that platforms obviously increase our electricity consumption, but I want to look much more about how platforms could, in principle, foster sustainability transitions. And as you may know, the sharing economy and to some extent the gig economy held in the beginning the promise of a sustainable innovation. What those platforms do by connecting many suppliers with many clients is that they lower prices, so making car use more affordable, making taxi more affordable, making tourism more affordable, which in a way is good for low-income people. They also, as was claimed, make more efficient use of resources. So, for example, if people can rent a car at a low price, they may do away their own car, and the total number of cars could be reduced substantially. And they would also add to the social cohesion in society, because all those online matches made by platforms lead to offline encounters between people who have never met each other before. Now, these promises, unfortunately, have not met a lot of empirical support. Although I should first say it's very hard to assess the effects in the first place, if only because as scientists, we do not get access to the data held by platforms. But for the kind of researchers that I know of that found a way to measure impacts, we know that rebound effects may be very significant. And the most obvious effect is that lower prices lead to savings, and those savings will be spent either on more of the same service or at different services. We also know that the substitution effects between platform services and more regular services can harm sustainability. So there have been a couple of cases on Uber that show that Uber has not led to fewer cars in the streets, but instead has lowered the use of public transport. It is also unlikely that a lot of new social contacts will emerge through platforms, because sharing and gig economy platforms, in essence, have an incentive not to promote social contact. Because every time people engage in a meaningful social contact offline, it may mean that the next transaction is also done offline instead of via the platform. And that's not good for the platform's business. And finally, there are concerns about the crowding out of altruism due to marketization, which means that while people before the advent of platforms would lend out their homes to family and friends when they were away, now they think twice because they can make serious money by offering their apartment online. So that is why these online marketplaces can actually hollow out offline social practices. But if we then think about, a bit more in the long term, there may be sustainable futures imaginable in which platforms play a key role. Now, first of all, if you think about the sharing economy, it goes to show that ownership is not a necessary condition anymore for many people to nevertheless consume certain services. So in many cities, you can indeed do without a car and without a parking space, which means that there is a reason for municipalities and national governments to tax much more the ownership of assets, and to lower the taxes or have zero taxes on the services that people peer-to-peer provide using those assets. So this will make people think twice to buy a car, for example, and at the same time it incentivizes car owners to rent out their car as a service to others. The second thing, which is a bit more speculative perhaps, is that I foresee a future in which many of these platforms who started out as a consumer-to-consumer platform nevertheless start to source assets and start to become more a business-to-consumer platform. And one example is private lease of cars in the Netherlands. So 1 out of 2 cars in the Netherlands is not owned anymore, but is leased by people from a leasing company. Now, if this trend continues and we will see a consolidation of that market into, say, 3 or 4 big players, then it means that as a government, you can regulate car technology just by negotiating with 4 parties. While before, you had to explain to millions of voters that they had to go to electric cars instead of gasoline cars, which was harder to explain. So the consolidation of many markets into platforms may give opportunities for governments to coordinate via regulation and negotiation certain sustainability transitions. And finally, I see the opportunity via these platform cooperatives, for example, to redistribute surplus in a fairer way. It is not anymore technologically very challenging to build your own platform. So if somehow users are able to organize via unions, via social movements, via other maybe municipality support, they can start using their own platforms and make sure that all the benefits from platforms go back to the ones that offer the services. So with these hopeful futures, I want to end my talk, and I want to thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much, Koen, for this very rich and very clear presentation on the platform economy, including some outlook on future perspectives for platforms. And I would like to ask the participants now to think briefly about possible questions that you may want to ask to Koen. Write them into the chat, and I will try to bring them into the discussion with Koen then. I'll just wait for some seconds for you to take some time. Maybe, Koen, you can have a sip of water in the meantime to refresh your throat. So, Koen, you are back, ready to take some questions, I guess. Let's start with the first question, which is, well, very up to current developments. So related to the sustainability futures question, how do you see the existence or the contribution of these platforms in times of the pandemic crisis that we are currently confronted with? How does this change the picture and the perspective for the platform economy?
Well, I think if you look at the last couple of months, you see that platforms have only reinforced their function and in a way their legitimacy by proving to be a very vital infrastructure to organize our lives, including delivery, of course, including social media and Zoom. And quite strikingly, the valuation of most of these companies have rapidly increased, while the valuation of other traditional companies have decreased. So yeah, this is also one of the advantages of platforms, that they create a lot of flexibility in times of crisis, also in times of natural disasters, for example. But there is not very much coordination going on between governments and platforms in times of crisis. Yeah, I think the pandemic shows the versatility and the vital nature of these platforms, who have become almost a public infrastructure. And that's also why some people say some of these infrastructures need to be either regulated as other infrastructures or even nationalized.
Thank you. There were some questions that were relating in a way to the strong hegemonic nature of several of these platforms. They are, if you like, also strong financial position that they developed due to a number of mechanisms. And there was also some questions that were relating to the question of, if you like, alternative models for platforms, so less hegemonic, more sustainable platform, or cooperatives, following the cooperatives model as an alternative to these hegemonic platform companies. And one of the examples is the Airbnb case, for instance. How would you see the perspectives for these like alternative platform models as compared to the hegemonic ones, as Flo Avellino put it? Do you see kind of promises and good perspective for those arising, or do you see them rather in a difficult position?
No. If we think about these very big platforms, we're not talking about sharing and gig economy. We're mostly talking about the big five that I started with. And if you go to sharing and gig economy platforms like Deliveroo, Uber, Helpling, Airbnb, they are not necessarily very successful yet. Apart from Airbnb, these platforms haven't made any profit yet, and there are serious questions whether they will ever make profit. But the reason they could nevertheless expand is because there is so much cheap venture capital, and they have been able to convince some of these very rich people to put a lot of, and also some pension funds, to put a lot of money into it. So in that sense, maybe it will just dissolve in a way on its own, and then automatically more local initiatives have more chance. Having said that, yeah, it may also be that that their popularity will only increase, and that we get stuck in many sectors with platforms that are out of democratic control, that are run from abroad, that violate privacy, etc. Yeah, the cooperative form is mentioned a lot as an alternative. There is a big movement called platform cooperativism, run from New York, from the New School in New York City. And yeah, there are many initiatives, but there are no good stories or templates how to do that. The good news, I think, for cooperatives is that you can enter the market in one single city, because you need to convince suppliers in one city to stop using the commercial platform and to start using their own local platform. And also local restaurants, for example, are experimenting with their own platforms just to become independent or less dependent on Deliveroo and Uber Eats. So that is also the difference with Facebook and Google. They operate on global markets and organize interactions at a global scale. But the gig economy and the sharing economy organize interactions on the very local scale. Now, local governments can also play a role in this. They can try to, and also NGOs, they can try to help people create their own cooperative platforms. We also see that some other kind of cooperatives, for example, in the insurance sector, start to invest in platform cooperatives. But yeah, if you read the latest experiences, they struggle yeah, to make it work and also to scale it up, because that's another disadvantage of cooperatives. It's one man, one vote, or yeah, one person, one vote principle, which means that each time you want to expand to another city, you get a lot of new members, and then you have to agree again on how you run the platform. So also in the government, we need some serious innovations, moving away from traditional cooperatives and having a bit more flexible cooperative model.
Yeah. Maybe let's switch to a slightly different context of where platform economy plays an important role in the global south. So in terms of the social component of sustainability, we see that these platforms in the global south can actually contribute to deepening poverty patterns, increase inequalities, and decrease the vulnerability of the people who depend on these platforms for making their living. So there the setting is still a bit different from the settings that we see here in Europe or in the US. What is your assessment of the role or the kind of balance between positive and negative impacts of these platforms in the global south in that specific context?
Well, I think the picture is very mixed, because yeah, in most global south contexts, the markets that are organized by platforms used to be very informal, and probably also very low paid and no protection whatsoever for the participants. Having these workers now being organized by a platform provides also scope for improving their positions. So in Indonesia, for example, you see that the government is very active in negotiating, and also successful to some extent in negotiating fairer pay and more democratic structures for taxi drivers, for example. So I haven't done research on my own, and it's fair to say that there's a lot of bias towards Western contexts, where in some cases pay is really going down. But in global south contexts, I think the pre-existing institutional structure was also not very satisfactory, and again, possibly it provides an opportunity for governments to implement some serious social policies.
Yeah. Well, one of the developments that we can see in relation to the platforms is this growing vertical integration from technology to the services. And this brings with it, if you like, really a kind of monopoly discussion, the strong entrenchment of this vertical integration, which is quite problematic, and which it also deepens the capture over data. So one of the questions is, do you see possibilities or a perspective for the unbundling of some of these systems, or what would be the caveats in such a kind of unbundling strategy which has been proposed by some and which was also addressed in one of the questions raised in the chat?
Well, on the one hand, yeah. So if you look at the car sector, and other sectors, I think indeed that platforms tend to start as a very much as an intermediary, and just creating a massive user base. Once they have created that user base, they can start to leverage that user base to buy very cheaply assets, for example, cars. You can lease a car via Uber. And that vertical integration, on the one hand, accumulates even more power, market power, and informational power in a few companies. But on the other hand, it provides opportunities for much more regulation of these markets, because again, governments just have to talk to a few of these big companies to make sure, for example, in the Netherlands, you could say, okay, if everyone buys private lease car, then it becomes easy for the government to say to those 4 companies that lease cars, to say in 5 years' time, all cars have to be electric, period. And then they will buy electric cars. For them, it doesn't matter because they have their business. And they are agnostic about the particular technology that is used. And that's why it can, again, also be an opportunity to have consolidation in markets that previously were very fragmented. So that regulation and environmental policies become easier to coordinate. But I'm an optimist guy.
Yeah, maybe let's still look at another dimension of the whole issue of platform economy. I mean, we've been discussing a lot about also questions of market power, monopoly issues, and so on. But there is also the entire question of data ethics, which is a kind of different inroad that may also influence a lot the strategies that we may want to pursue from a public perspective in further shaping or contributing to the shaping of these platforms. So when you think about ethics of data, data ownership, who owns the behavioral data, for instance, can it be owned by somebody, but by a private company, or is it something that is common, part of the commons? To what extent shall it be used to generate profits? What would you see as potential perspectives from that angle?
First of all, I think we should be careful in assuming that the massive amounts of data that companies hold are economically very valuable per se, because with every new information about a person, the benefits go down, because you only need a few things to know about a person to have an algorithm offer him a certain advertisement, for example. So I haven't seen good evidence that big data and AI are really improving productivity. So maybe this bubble will burst anytime soon. This leaves aside the ethical question, which obviously is very important. And I think we enter now in a new era due to the GDPR. The GDPR can have all kinds of beneficial unintended consequences in how we organize platforms, because people have the right to know how their data are being used by platforms. However, as an individual, you have no incentive to spend hours and hours to find out what they do. But if individuals organize in collectives, and as they do now, they can bring these platforms to court. And the first court case is upcoming in Amsterdam anytime soon. And a possible outcome is that not just the data, but also the algorithms, so how the data are being processed, have to be made public. And that that will mean that it's much easier again for other platforms to enter the market and copy those algorithms. And it also helps people to understand what is going on, and maybe then they become more careful to start just using any app that is presented to them. So it's early days, and but Europe is ahead in privacy protection and also in competition law. The European Commission wants to reassess the way they have been doing antitrust, because in the past almost the only criterion that people looked at was consumer welfare. Well, and if you reason from consumer welfare, platforms are great because they lower prices, and in many cases their services are completely free because you pay with through your eyeballs looking at advertisements. So from that perspective, there's hardly any reason to intervene. But now the Commission and also some economists are rethinking competition law to include all the stakeholders in the equation, and also the limited market power of suppliers, of freelancers, and so forth. And then in that kind of balance of power framework, maybe there are ways to break up some of these platforms.
Yeah. I think we are moving a bit towards the question of how platforms might evolve in the future. I gather from your previous response that, if you like, you would not tend to see too much impact of artificial intelligence on the kind of structural setup of the platform, but there may be rather, if you like, other influences, for instance, for user forums to have an influence, also because it is opened up and enabled by the kind of legal possibilities of the GDPR. Could you maybe comment on that perspective, on the kind of future role of these user platforms or stakeholder platforms, more widely speaking, in relation to platforms?
Well, if you look at the consumer side, they are completely passive. So consumer organizations hardly, they're hardly active. But on the worker side, we see unions and also new type of unions emerging to organize these freelancers. And here there's also an interesting legal development going on, because in the past freelancers were not allowed to unionize because they are independent businesses, which would mean they would create a cartel if they would create a union. But now countries are revising that and allow people forms of unionization. And the more radical reform that is upcoming in many countries, that's my prediction at least, is that at least for some platforms, people will no longer be classified as freelancers but as employees. If there is true surveillance and control over your work, I think labor law will evolve in such a way that it will be seen as an employee-employment relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that platforms will massively employ people, because it will make them much less versatile and services will become more expensive. But they will revise their algorithms and revise their business model in a way that people can truly act as a freelancer and are no longer punished for whatever reason. And then platforms become more the open marketplaces as they were claiming to be in the beginning. So I think in the future will be shaped by regulation and also indeed by collective action that pushes for certain regulation in the interest for certain groups. While technologically, I don't think much more innovation will happen, except perhaps for Internet of Things, because once also objects become market participants and objects can automatically buy and sell their services, then you have a new wave of platforms in which we have to solve new type of problems about ownership, about liability, about safety of objects, which can be exciting, because also there are possible sustainability gains to be made.
There is one question that is very nicely formulated that I'll directly read from the chat, and it refers to the question to the issue of certification and standard. So, as for many initiatives in food provision system certification, is there a move towards certification and standards of small and medium platforms that could deliver signs of values for their clients, including then, for instance, also sustainability concerns or societal concerns? So in a way, this is a kind of certification and standardization question, and the quality control question in the very end as well for platforms. Do you see signs of this emerging?
I think the platforms, these local initiatives, for example, local to local, that you buy food from local farmers, they have, of course, a lot of legitimacy, but they have a problem of providing reliable service and also a problem of scaling. And at the same time, you don't want to. The good thing is that these local platforms are truly embedded in the local community. So what I see happening is that local platforms do not try to scale up, but they try to create umbrella organizations that provide them with the public goods, if you like standard certification, maybe joint marketing, joint software, and then you get a platform of platforms. And that also is possible within a cooperative form, because if you have local cooperatives, they themselves can be a member of a national cooperative. So you can continue this as many times you want. So I see this happening, because what is interesting of these local social movements is that they do not want to scale per se, and they want to keep that local connection. But they also know that if they collaborate in across different regions, that they can manage quality and software and finances much better. So I think we can also learn from the past, especially in agriculture, but also in other sectors, where like the dairy industry, where the first wave of factories were privately owned. And they were using these steam engines, but then the benefits went to the factory and not to the farmers, and then the farmers started to their own cooperatives as a reaction to that, and then those very small farmer cooperatives gradually grew into very big cooperatives. So these local developments may take much longer to scale up, and they will do it in different ways, in a more stacked manner, compared to venture capital backed platforms who can incur losses and then scale very fast. So that's why I think it's too early days to say the cooperative model will not work, because theoretically there are the same kind of reasons that historically explained the rise of cooperatives in certain sectors, as now with platforms, because you need, as users, to reap the benefits of your work, instead of having a big middleman appropriating all your surplus. So historians are yeah, we can learn here from the historians.
Yeah, maybe I'll come to a last question now, because we are approaching, I think, the end of our session, and this is a more conceptual one. So what do you think of the argument that these companies, these platform companies, are essentially manufacturing or really shaping behavioral futures? They change the way we behave and we act. So it's not just about selling services, but about shaping behavior. This is, I think, an interesting conceptual question, and maybe also kind of very philosophical question.
No, I think I would agree with that, because they put a lot of emphasis on the user experience and the design of their services, and they do that in a very data-driven manner, because they can track even eyeballs of people and how they use the platform. And they can also experiment very well, because a platform can just give a new type of design to 10% of their users and then see what behavioral changes it fosters. And if there are changes that they like, they will switch to that design. So they can, in a data-driven manner, optimize their platform for their own benefit. And what I am worried about, apart from other things, is that social science itself will adopt platforms. That is, that the best experiments done by psychologists and sociologists will be increasingly done in collaboration with online platforms, because only if you work together with an online platform, you have access to thousands or even millions of participants. And you see this happening, that the platforms collaborate with the Ivy League universities in the US, the sociologists, economists at those universities. They are the only ones that are granted access to their database to do research, especially behavioral research, but only on questions that are negotiated with the platform. And then they publish those results in the top journals, because statistically, and also in terms of research design, you have something unique. But this violates our research ethics, because it cannot be replicated, and the research design is partially negotiated with the company. So I also think we can also discuss the platforms in our own publishing industry, where not only scientific publishing has embraced the platform models, also with open access models, and we still pay far too much to publish, and they reap most of the commercial benefits. But we also see publishers entering online teaching and trying to have us produce content that they can then resell at very low costs to millions of people in the world. And also universities are not well organized to think about, okay, how do we want to use platforms for the benefits of our students and our teaching staff? And if they don't develop a strategy, then the commercial publishers will be very eager to enter this profitable online teaching market, I fear.
Well, with your last remarks, you pointed to a vast field of further debate that we could dive into. But I think we would need to organize a dedicated session on that specifically. So consequences for our own profession and professions of these platforms and their potential forms of use in research and education. I certainly haven't been able to pick up all the questions, but I hope that we have been able to cover quite a lot of the ground of the questions raised in the chat. I would like to thank you a lot, Koen, for your thoroughly thought answers. Usually I would ask everybody to give you a hand, but this is not possible under the given circumstances, so you have to imagine the kind of applause by the audience for your presentation and for your answers. So once again, thanks a lot. And before we now move to a break, I would still like a brief announcement regarding the subsequent sessions that we are having on the agenda. So we will now and afterwards have 2 dialogue sessions that will focus on making transitions happen and the Viennese experience. So specifically looking at some of the experiences made with transition-oriented policies here in Vienna. One of them will be looking at innovations for the future of social housing in Vienna, which discusses the long-standing experience here in Vienna with social housing, which started actually in particular after the First World War, and the kind of international association that we have. No, it's not an association, it's the IBA, it's a kind of exposition in Vienna in particular. And the aims in its context of the challenge of making sustainability transitions happening in the context of the future of social housing. So the new social housing aims to question these existing patterns of behavior, renegotiated processes and involving new actors, linking municipalities, housing companies and social policies. So that's one of the very interesting parts. The other one is on the Viennese smart city experience in the context of the challenge to make sustainability transitions happen. So looking at questions such as why does the city of Vienna draw on the contested concept of smart cities? Some people think that this is a rather ambiguous term. What is Smart City Vienna about and how does it contribute to urban sustainability transitions? And in parallel, we'll have various paper sessions and later on also another dialogue session powered and supported by the Chamber of Labor in Vienna on the topic of just transitions. So just to give you a bit of an outlook on the upcoming sessions for the remainder of the day. And of course, our STRN dinner speech by Jochen Markart and Lea Schilling, which I hope you all will enjoy, will be connected to a live concert, another art performance of Ganymede, another one of which you could see yesterday evening, and as another speed dating activity for those who liked it and would like to continue getting to know new colleagues from the transitions community. So with this, I would like to thank you as an audience for your nice and interesting questions, and of course, Koen Frenken once again for his talk and his inspiring answers. So I suggest we close the session now, and I wish you a nice continuation of the online conference. Thank you. Bye.